Frank Sinatra was driving through Beverly Hills at 3 in the morning when he made the decision to turn left on Mountain Drive instead of continuing home to Rancho Mirage. He had been driving for 2 hours, just driving, not going anywhere in particular. The call had come at midnight, Sammy Davis Jr. on the other end, his voice tight and careful in the way it got when he was trying not to cry. "Frank, it's Dean, his kid." The plane went down. Frank hadn't said anything for a long moment. Then he asked, "Where's Dean now?" "At his house. He's alone. Frank, Jeannie's there, but she's in another room. He won't let anyone near him." Frank hung up without saying goodbye. He got in his car and started driving, not toward Dean's house. Not yet, just driving, because Frank knew what was coming. He knew what he was going to see when he got to Dean's house, and he needed time to prepare himself for it. Dean Martin lived on Mountain Drive in Beverly Hills, in a large house with gates and a long driveway and enough distance from the street that nobody could see in. Frank had been to the house 100 times, for parties, for dinners, for quiet nights when Dean would cook spaghetti and they would watch westerns on television without talking, but Frank had never been to the house for this, never been there to see Dean Martin, the king of cool, the man who never let anything touch him, come completely apart. The news had broken that afternoon, March 21st, 1987. Captain Dean Paul Martin, age 35, pilot in the California Air National Guard, had been killed when his F-4 Phantom jet crashed into Mount San Gorgonio during a training mission. The jet had gone down in a snowstorm. There would be no survivors. Dean Martin's son was dead. The golden boy, the one who had done everything right, the one Dean had been so quietly, impossibly proud of, gone. Frank pulled up to the gates at 3:15 a.m. He didn't call ahead. He just pressed the intercom button and waited. A voice came through the speaker. It was Dean's assistant, a woman named Irma. "Mr. Sinatra." "Open the gate, Irma." There was a pause. Then the gates swung open. Frank drove up the long driveway and parked near the front entrance. The house was dark except for one light on the second floor, Dean's bedroom. Frank sat in the car for a moment, looking at that single light. Then he got out and walked to the front door. Irma opened it before he could knock. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were red. "He's upstairs," she said quietly. "He won't talk to anyone. He's just sitting there." Frank nodded. "Where's Jeannie?" "She tried to go in a few hours ago. He told her to leave. She's in the guest room now." Frank walked past Irma and climbed the stairs. The house was silent. Not peaceful silent, tomb silent, the kind of silence that happens when something so terrible has occurred that even the building itself seems to be holding its breath. Dean's bedroom door was closed. Frank stood outside it for a moment. Then he knocked. No answer. Frank knocked again. "Dean, it's Frank." Nothing. Frank tried the door. It was unlocked. He opened it and walked in. Dean was sitting in a chair by the window, staring out at nothing. He was wearing pajamas and a robe. There was a glass in his hand, but it was empty. He didn't turn around when Frank entered, didn't acknowledge that anyone had come into the room, just kept staring out the window. Frank closed the door behind him. He walked over to the bed and sat down on the edge of it. He didn't say anything. He just sat there looking at Dean's back, at the way his shoulders were hunched forward, at the way he was holding that empty glass like he had forgotten it was in his hand. They sat like that for maybe 5 minutes, maybe longer. Time didn't seem to work right in that room. Finally, Dean spoke. His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." Frank didn't respond immediately. Then he said, "Where else would I be?" Dean shook his head slowly. "I don't want you here. I don't want anyone here." "I know. Then why did you come?" Frank thought about that question. Why had he come? What could he possibly say or do that would make any difference? What could anyone say to a father whose son had just been erased from the sky? "Because you would have come for me," Frank said finally. Dean made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else. "Would I?" "Yes." Dean turned around for the first time. Frank saw his face and had to work to keep his own expression neutral. Dean Martin looked like he had aged 20 years in 12 hours. His eyes were hollow. His skin was gray. The easy charm that had defined him for 40 years was completely gone, replaced by something raw and broken. "You know what the worst part is?" Dean asked. Frank waited. "They told me he died instantly. They said the impact would have been so fast he wouldn't have felt anything. They said it like that was supposed to make me feel better." Dean stood up and walked to the window. "But all I can think about is the moment before. That last second when he saw the mountain. When he knew. Was he scared, Frank? Did he have time to be scared?" Frank didn't have an answer for that. There was no answer for that. He was a pilot. Dean, he knew the risks. He accepted them. Dean's hand tightened on the empty glass. "Don't give me that military honor bullshit. He was my son. He was my kid. And now he's dead and they're telling me I can't even see him. Can't even see the body because there's nothing left to see. You understand that? There's nothing left." The glass in Dean's hand shattered. He had been gripping it so hard it just broke. Blood started running down his palm. Dean looked at his hand like he didn't understand where the blood was coming from. Frank stood up and walked over to him. He took Dean's hand and looked at the cuts. They weren't deep, just surface damage. Frank pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wrapped it around Dean's palm. Sit down, Frank said. Dean didn't move. Dean, sit down. Dean's legs seemed to give out. He sat down heavily in the chair. Frank knelt down and picked the glass fragments out of Dean's hand. Dean watched him do it without saying anything. When Frank had gotten all the glass out, he tied the handkerchief tighter. You need to get this looked at tomorrow. Dean shook his head. I don't need anything. Frank stood up and walked over to the bar in the corner of the room. He poured 2 glasses of scotch. He walked back and handed one to Dean. Dean looked at it. I've been sitting here for 8 hours and I haven't had a drink. Did you know that? 8 hours and I haven't touched a drop. Why not? Because if I start drinking, I won't stop. And if I don't stop, then what? Then I'm just some drunk whose son died. I'm just another sad bastard who couldn't handle it. Frank set the glass down on the table next to Dean. You're a sad bastard who can't handle it. And you know what? That's okay. That's what you're supposed to be right now. Dean looked up at Frank. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up, that someone's going to call and say there was a mistake, that it was some other pilot, some other kid, not mine, not Dino. Frank sat back down on the bed. Nobody's going to call. Dean's face crumpled. It happened fast. 1 second he was holding it together. The next second everything broke. He put his face in his hands and started to cry. Not quiet crying, not dignified crying. Deep, wrenching sobs that sounded like they were being torn out of him. Frank sat there and watched. He didn't try to comfort Dean. Didn't tell him it would be okay. Didn't do anything except sit there and bear witness. After a while, Dean stopped. He lifted his head and wiped his face with his good hand. I'm sorry for what? For this, for falling apart. Frank shook his head. Dean, your son died. You're allowed to fall apart. Dean picked up the glass of scotch and drank it in one swallow. Then he said, I don't know how to do this, Frank. I don't know how to be the father of a dead son. I don't know how to go to a funeral and stand there while they play taps and fold a flag and hand it to me like that's supposed to mean something. I don't know how to keep living when he's not here. Frank didn't have an answer for that either, because the truth was, he didn't know either. Frank had children. He had Nancy, Frank Jr., and Tina. He had imagined in his darkest moments what it would be like to lose one of them, but imagination was nothing compared to the reality Dean was living through right now. You do it one day at a time, Frank said finally. You wake up tomorrow. You get through tomorrow. Then you do it again the next day. And eventually, I don't know, maybe it gets easier, maybe it doesn't. But you keep going. Dean looked at him. Why? What's the point? The point is you're still here. You've got other kids. You've got people who need you. You've got, I don't want to be here. Dean interrupted. You understand that. I don't want to be here without him. I keep thinking, what if I had told him not to fly that day? What if I had called him that morning and asked him to come visit? What if I had done something different? Would he still be alive? Frank leaned forward. Dean, listen to me. This wasn't your fault. There was nothing you could have done. The jet went down in a storm. It was an accident. A terrible, horrible accident. But it wasn't your fault. Dean shook his head. You don't understand. The last time I talked to him, we argued. It was stupid. It was about nothing. He wanted me to come see one of his shows and I said I was too busy. Too busy. And now I'll never. His voice broke again. Frank stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the dark Los Angeles night. The last conversation I had with my father, we argued too. About money. He wanted to borrow some money and I said no. I said I was tired of him always asking. 3 weeks later he died. And for years I carried that around. The fact that the last thing I said to my old man was no. Frank turned back to Dean. But you know what I figured out eventually? The last conversation doesn't define the relationship. All those other conversations, all those other moments, those matter more. And you had a lot of good moments with Dino, a lot of good years. Dean was quiet for a long time. Then he said, he was proud of me. Did you know that? He told me once that he was proud to be my son, not because of the fame or the money, just because he thought I was a good man. And I looked at him and I thought, this kid, this beautiful kid, he thinks I'm a good man. And I knew I wasn't. I knew I was just some singer from Steubenville who got lucky, but he believed it, and that made me want to be better. Frank walked back over and sat down. You are a good man, Dean. You were a good father. Dino knew that. He knew you loved him. Dean wiped his eyes again. It doesn't matter. He's still dead. Loving him didn't keep him alive. No, Frank said. It didn't, but it mattered. It mattered to him, and it should matter to you. They sat in silence for a while longer. Outside, the sky was starting to lighten. Dawn was coming. Another day that Dean would have to get through. Another day that Dino wouldn't be part of. Finally, Dean said, I don't think I can do the funeral. I don't think I can stand there in front of all those people and pretend to be strong. You don't have to pretend to be anything. You just have to show up. I don't know if I can. Frank stood up. I'll be there with you. Sammy will be there. All of us will be there. You won't have to do it alone. Dean looked up at him. Why are you doing this, Frank? Why are you sitting here at 4 in the morning listening to me fall apart? Frank thought about that. About all the years he and Dean had known each other. about all the shows they had done together, about all the laughs and the fights and the long stretches where they didn't talk because they didn't need to, about the fact that Dean Martin was probably the closest thing to a brother Frank had ever had. Because that's what we do, Frank said. We show up for each other, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Dean nodded slowly. Then he said, I'm tired, Frank. I'm so goddamn tired. Then sleep. I'll stay here. You don't have to. I'm staying. Frank walked over to the chair in the corner of the room and sat down. Dean looked at him for a moment. Then he stood up and walked to the bed. He lay down on top of the covers, still wearing his robe. Within minutes he was asleep. The kind of sleep that comes from complete exhaustion. The kind of sleep where your body just shuts down because it can't take any more. Frank sat in the chair and watched Dean sleep. He sat there as the sun came up. He sat there as the house started to wake up around him. He sat there because he had told Dean he would stay, and Frank Sinatra kept his word. Around 7 in the morning, Jeannie knocked softly on the door and came in. She looked at Dean sleeping, then at Frank sitting in the chair. Thank you, she whispered. Frank just nodded. I can stay with him now, Jeannie said. You should go home. Get some rest. Frank stood up. His back was stiff from sitting in the chair for 3 hours. He walked quietly to the door. Before he left, he turned back to look at Dean one more time. Dean was still asleep, one arm thrown over his face, his breathing slow and steady. He looked peaceful, but Frank knew it wouldn't last. Knew that when Dean woke up, he would have to remember all over again, would have to face the fact that his son was dead, would have to figure out how to keep living in a world that didn't make sense anymore. Frank left the house and got in his car. He sat in the driveway for a moment, suddenly feeling his own exhaustion. He was 71 years old, too old to be staying up all night, too old to be sitting in uncomfortable chairs watching his friends break apart. But age didn't matter. Friendship didn't have an expiration date. Dean had needed him, and Frank had shown up. That's all there was to it. The funeral was held on March 24th, 3 days later. It was a military ceremony. There were honor guards and a 21-gun salute and a flag-draped casket that didn't actually contain a body because there wasn't enough left of Dino to bury. Dean stood through the entire ceremony without crying. He wore dark glasses. He stood straight. He accepted the folded flag from the officer. He looked like he was somewhere else, like his body was going through the motions, but his mind was a million miles away. Frank stood next to him the entire time. So did Sammy. They didn't hold Dean up physically, but they were there, close enough that Dean knew he wasn't alone, close enough that if he started to fall, they would catch him. After the ceremony, after everyone had left, Dean turned to Frank and said, I'm done. Frank didn't ask what he meant. He knew. Dean meant he was done performing, done pretending, done being Dean Martin the entertainer, done playing the happy drunk who didn't care about anything, because caring had destroyed him and he didn't have it in him to care anymore. Dean Martin performed occasionally after that day. He did a few shows. He made some appearances. But it wasn't the same. The spark was gone. The joy was gone. He was just going through the motions, killing time until he could join his son. He died on Christmas Day, 1995, 8 years after Dino's crash. The doctor said it was respiratory failure, but everyone who knew Dean understood the truth. Dean Martin had died on March 21, 1987. His body just took 8 years to figure it out. Frank Sinatra spoke at Dean's funeral. He stood at the podium and looked out at the packed church and said, Dean Martin was my friend. He was my brother. He was the funniest man I ever knew and the saddest. He loved his children more than anything in the world. And when he lost his son, he lost the only reason he had to keep going. So he didn't. He just waited. And now he's with Dino again. And I hope, wherever they are, Dean is finally smiling again. Frank died 3 years later. In 1998, among his personal effects was a photograph that his children found in his bedroom. It was a picture of the Rat Pack from the 1960s, Frank, Dean and Sammy on stage at the Sands, laughing about something. On the back of the photograph, in Frank's handwriting, were 2 words, the brothers. That's what they had been, not by blood, but by choice. Brothers who had shown up for each other when it mattered, whereas who had sat with each other in the dark and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. Brothers who had understood that sometimes the only thing you can do for someone in pain is to be there, to show up at 3 in the morning and sit in an uncomfortable chair and watch them sleep. That night on Mountain Drive, when Frank had driven 2 hours just to work up the courage to knock on Dean's door, he had known he couldn't fix anything, couldn't bring Dino back, couldn't take away Dean's pain, couldn't make any of it better, but he had gone anyway, because that's what you do when someone you love is falling apart. You show up, you sit with them, you stay, and when they're finally able to sleep, you keep watch, you make sure they're not alone. That was Frank Sinatra's gift to Dean Martin on the worst night of his life. Not comfort, not wisdom, just presence, just the simple, profound act of showing up when it would have been easier to stay away.